Let's take a look at basic brushes and brush selection. If we go over to our left shelf here at the top, we've got the brush selector icon. If we click on that, it pulls up the brush selector menu. And here we see all of the brushes that are preloaded into ZBrush in the startup folder. There's quite a few here, but there's several that you'll find yourself coming back to time and time again. The standard brush is a very common brush that you'll find yourself using. This brush will give you a rounded stroke, kind of like a soft brush in Photoshop, where if we zoom in on this and then turn off our floor grid, we can see that the stroke that it gives you is sort of a curve or like a hill. If we hold Alt, we're going to get that same effect in the negative. Another common brush that you'll find yourself using are the clay brushes. There's several different types of this, but we'll just start off with the regular clay brush. And this brush will affect the surface more in a plateau than the standard brush does, which gives you more of a hill effect. So if we take a look at the cross section of this brush, you see that it builds up more flat across the top, as opposed to being rounded like the standard brush is. You'll notice if I continue to stroke over my marks without letting up on my stylus, that eventually it stops building up on the form. It will just find the high point of that stroke and stop building up. In order to build up beyond that, I have to actually start a new stroke on top. There is a variation of the clay brush that's quite popular called the clay buildup brush. And this one adds a buildup effect so that if I continue a stroke over itself again and again, it will continue to build outward on that stroke as I go. Like the standard brush, if I hold Alt and make a mark on the model, it's going to carve into the surface as opposed to build out from it. The standard and the clay brushes act as if you are laying down pieces of clay onto your model. The move brush, on the other hand, acts more like you are pulling and pushing the model with your fingers. So you grab sections of the mesh and you can pull them out, push them back in order to affect larger changes to the form very quickly, much faster than you could with the standard or the clay brushes. These effects take place on the picture plane, meaning that if I'm pulling out or pushing in a form, I'm doing it on the plane of the canvas. Alternatively, if I use the Alt key, I can actually move out and in based on the surface normal of the vertex that I start on. The previous brushes that we've used have all been additive brushes by default, meaning that the initial button that they have on for sculpting is this button here, Z Add. You also have Z Sub and Z Cut. Z Cut we won't really use at all. Z Sub sets the default to carving into the mesh as opposed to building out from it. The next two brushes that we're going to use are going to have Z Sub as their default setting. Trim Dynamic and H Polish are great for carving in curved or flat planes onto our mesh for a more geometric look. We'll start off with Trim Dynamic. This brush is set to Z Sub by default, so if I just stroke onto our mesh, I'm carving in a plane onto the form. This isn't a flat plane, this plane is curved with the mesh. So I can come in here and add a almost faceted look to the form. With Trim Dynamic, if you hold Alt, you can build outward. It will still flatten the form, but it will be pulling slightly out at the same time. And then I can come in and smooth an area and then come back with trim dynamic. So you can work back and forth with adding and subtracting in order to get the shape that you want. The one thing to note about trim dynamic is that it does not respect sharp edges and corners, meaning that if I stroke over a corner, it's going to wipe that out. The H polish brush works similar to the trim dynamic, except that it respects hard edges on your mesh. Meaning that if I stroke over cornered areas, it's actually going to try to keep the corner and maybe even sharpening it. This works really well as a secondary brush to the trim dynamic to polish and refine the edges you create with trim dynamic. The last initial brush that we'll talk about is the Damien Standard or DAM Standard brush. This is a brush based on the standard brush with an alpha on it to create a sharper line. This is great for drawing out lines in the planning stages, as well as to get creases, wrinkles. You'll find yourself using Damien Standard quite often. The alt version of Damien Standard builds outward to create a more sharpened ridge, whereas the standard carves in. So we've talked about several useful brushes that you'll find yourself coming to time and time again. However, it's a very inefficient way to pick brushes to have to come up to the brush selector and find it every time in order to activate it. Even if you get used to finding where they are, this is still a time-consuming act. But there's a much faster way. By simply hitting B, as in brush, I can pull up the brush picker. Then, if I know the first letter of the brush that I want, I can press that, such as the D for Damien Standard. And then you'll see that there is a letter at the upper left-hand corner. This is the second selection letter. Each brush is going to have its own second letter, which means that if you want to select a brush quickly, all you have to know is its two-letter designation. So you always hit B first, and then for Damien Standard it would be D and S. For the standard brush, it would be B, S, and T. For the move brush, it's B, M, and V. And for trim dynamic, it's B, T, and D. For H polish, it's B, H, P. The clay brush is B, C, L, and the clay buildup brush is B, C, B. Now, occasionally your hand might slip, and instead of hitting B, you may accidentally hit the V key, and suddenly your model turns black, and you're wondering what happened. Don't worry about this, simply hit the V key again. All that's happened is you've switched colors right here. It's also this button, the switch color button, underneath the color swatches. If you accidentally have moved even farther over and you hit the C button, it's going to select the color that's directly under the cursor. So if I'm over the canvas and I hit C, now I've got a dark gray selected. If that happens, just come over and grab and bring this back up to white.